Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Meghan O'Giblin to our At Home with Literati series in support of God, Human, Animal, Machine, and in conversation this evening with T. Madden. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed this evening, but you can keep the chat window open as I'll be sharing links to purchase God, Human, Animal, Machine from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature that's available to you on the toolbar to submit questions at any time, and I will ask a selection of your questions at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. And live transcription is available to you as well on your toolbar should you need that. There's a little CC icon right below you. And of course, if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You can also find links to check out more of our upcoming events live. And of course, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch our events at your leisure. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And of course, if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we would just like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon or later this evening, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. Without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Meghan O'Giblin is the author of the essay collection Interior States, which is published to wide acclaim and won the Believer Book Award for nonfiction. Her writing has received 3 Pushcart Prizes and appeared in the Best American Essays anthology. She writes essays and features for Harper's Magazine, The New Yorker, The Guardian, Wired, The New York Times, and elsewhere. She lives with her husband in Madison, Wisconsin. And T. Madden is the founding editor-in-chief of No Tokens, a magazine of literature and art, and has received fellowships from McDowell, Hedgebrook, Tin House, and Yaddo, where she was selected for the 2017 Linda Collins Endowed Residency Award. Her debut memoir, Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, was a New York Times Editor's Choice selection, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, and a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for lesbian memoir. Please join me in welcoming Meghan O'Giblin and T. Madden into your living rooms.
I'm so happy to be here, Meghan. I would love for you to read first, but I'm just overjoyed. So I'll sit back now and listen.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, I'm going to read just a short section from the book. I just wanted to say thanks so much to Literati for hosting. Thanks to John for facilitating this. And thanks so much to Tikira for being in conversation with me for this event. So I'm going to read a short section from a chapter about some robots that showed up here at the UW campus in Madison a few years ago. Nobody could say when exactly the robots arrived. They seemed to have been smuggled onto campus during the break without any official announcement, explanation, or warning. There were a few dozen of them in total, small white boxes on wheels with yellow flags affixed on top for visibility. They navigated the sidewalks near campus autonomously, using cameras, radar, and ultrasonic sensors. They were there for the students, bearing deliveries that had been ordered via an app from University Food Services. But everyone I knew who worked on campus had some anecdote about their first encounter. These stories were shared, at least in the beginning, with amusement or a note of performative exasperation. Some people complained that the machines had made free use of bike paths, but were ignorant of social norms. They refused to yield to pedestrians and traveled slowly in the passing lane, backing up traffic. One morning, a friend of mine who was running late to his class nudged his bike right up behind one of the bots, intending to run it off the road, but it just kept plodding along its course, oblivious. Another friend, returning from her lunch break, discovered a bot trapped helplessly in a bike rack. It was heavy, and she had to enlist the help of a passerby to free it. Thankfully, it was just a bike rack, she said. Just wait till they start crashing into bicycles and moving cars. Among the students, the only problem was an excess of affection. The bots were often held up during their delivery runs because students insisted on taking selfies with the machines outside the dorms or chatting with them. The robots had minimum speech capacities. They were able to emit greetings and instructions and to say, "Thank you, have a nice day," as they rolled away. And yet this was enough to have endeared them to many people as social creatures. The bots often returned to their stations with notes affixed to them. "Hello, robot, we love you." They inspired a proliferation of memes on the university's social media pages. One student dressed a bot in a hat and scarf, snapped a photo, and created a profile for it on a dating app. Its name was listed as 100111. Its age, 18. Occupation, delivery boy. Orientation, asexual robot. Around this time, autonomous machines were popping up all over the country. Grocery stores were using them to patrol aisles, searching for spills and debris. Walmart had introduced them into its supercenters to keep track of out-of-stock items. A New York Times story reported that many of these robots had been christened with nicknames by their human coworkers and appended with name badges. One was thrown a birthday party where it was given, among other gifts, a can of WD-40 lubricant. The article presented these anecdotes wryly, for the most part, as instances of harmless anthropomorphism. But the same instinct was already driving public policy. A year or so earlier, the European Parliament had proposed that robots should be deemed electronic persons, arguing that certain forms of AI had become sophisticated enough to be considered responsible agents. It was a legal distinction made within the context of liability law, though the language seemed to summon an animist cosmology, wherein all kinds of inanimate objects, trees and rocks, pipes and kettles, are considered non-human persons. It made me think of the opening of a 1967 poem by Richard Brautigan, All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace. Brautigan writes, "I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony, like pure water touching clear sky." Brautigan penned these lines during the summer of love, from the heart of the counterculture of San Francisco. The poem's subsequent stanzas elaborate on this enchanted landscape of cybernetic forests and flower-like computers, a world in which digital technologies reunite us with, quote, our mammal brothers and sisters, where man and robot and beast achieve true equality. The work evokes a particular subgenre of West Coast utopianism, one that recalls the Back to the Land movement and Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog, which envisioned the tools of the American industrial complex repurposed to bring about a more equitable and ecologically sustainable world. Brautigan's poem imagines technology returning us to a pre-modern and perhaps pre-Christian period of history when humans lived in harmony with nature and inanimate objects were enchanted with life. Echoes of this dream can still be found in conversations about technology. It is reiterated by those like MIT's David Rose, who speculate that the Internet of Things will soon enchant everyday objects, imbuing doorknobs, thermostats, refrigerators, and cars with responsiveness and intelligence. It can be found in the work of post-human theorists like Jane Bennett, who imagines digital technologies reconfiguring our modern understanding of dead matter and reviving a more ancient ontology, wherein, as she writes, matter has a liveliness, resilience, unpredictability, and recalcitrance that is itself a source of wonder for us. I like to think, begins each stanza of Brautigan's poem, a refrain that reads less like a poetic device than a mystical invocation. This vision of the future may be just another form of wishful thinking, but it is a compelling one, if only because of its historical symmetry. It seems only right that technology should restore to us the enchanted world that technology itself destroyed. Perhaps the very forces that facilitated our exile from Eden will one day reanimate our garden with digital life. Perhaps the only way out is through. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
unmute before I clap. And I wish we were in a room where we could hear everybody's applause. Thank you so much for reading that, Megan. Thank you, Literati, and thanks for everyone for being here. I love this book so much. I imagine people in this room perhaps have already read it. And if you haven't, I found this book just terrifying and glorious and fascinating and an education and so moving. It's really changed my life reading this book, and it's changed my thinking. And you and I have very, very different backgrounds. And I feel especially honored to be here talking to you because of that. It's introduced me to so many new concepts and ideas. And while I feel a little out of my element or intimidated to ask about some of those ideas, I think we can still have a conversation about what it was like building such a book. And as we all heard just now, like the narrative beauty of this book and your prose and the writing itself is just magnificent. And I learned so much on a sentence level as well. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. It's really, really wonderful to
hear.
hear.
Of course. And Megan and I have I've had the honor of talking to you before in a conversation with F&M, and that was so much fun too. So I'm really just excited to be sharing this space with you, even though we haven't met, and I hope we can fix that one day.
Yes, hopefully one day in person.
Yes. I'd love to know about, I was thinking a lot about the organization of this book and like kind of where it began, because you have me thinking about like systems and rather than a central core or a central brain or idea. If you've read the book, you'll maybe know what I mean here, but I'm thinking more about systems and different parts and the communication between those parts, as you so beautifully articulate in this book. And it made me think about the construction of the book itself in terms of these separate sections and essays, and how you conceived of this as a whole, and maybe how you found the ordering and the shape and the structure, or maybe you collaborated with editors in finding that shape or structure. But if you could just walk us through what that looked like for you, I'd be so interested.
Yeah, it was a real challenge in a lot of ways writing this book, because I started my writing career as an essayist, and I still consider myself primarily an essayist. And the thought of doing a cohesive project was just really intimidating to me. And I had a friend who's, another essayist, writer friend, who said early on, just like conceive of it like it's a big essay. Just imagine you're writing an essay, but it can go on for much longer, which felt initially like a really freeing way to think about it. And so I tried doing that for the first draft, and it was just a mess because I wasn't used to working at that scope. Was just really, and especially I think with all the research involved, I usually, a lot of my essays incorporate outside sources and research, but not to the degree that this book does. So it took many drafts, I think, before the book started to take its shape. And eventually I sort of scrapped the idea of it being one big essay and sort of started to think of it as sort of a system. I like the way you described it as a system, because I do feel like that's sort of how it works, a system of several interlinked essays. So there is, I think, the book is divided into, now I'm wondering how many sections, I forgot, I think 5 or 6 sections that each have a title: image, pattern, network, paradox, metonymy, algorithm, and virality. And I didn't have those titles at the beginning, but I sort of had a brief view of sort of what each section was going to be about. And then it was sort of like, as I was writing, that it was sort of like, building these essays right on top of each other, where you're sort of drawing themes from the previous ones into, trying to think of like what a good metaphor would be, something to do with like weaving or something, where you're drawing parts of what you've already done into the new sections as well. And it's interesting how some of those themes, like those ways that I titled the sections, those words sort of emerged during the writing process. I didn't have them up front. And I don't know. I think all writers can kind of relate to this, where you feel like there is like this weird analogy with, writing about computers and sort of this idea of like emergent intelligence, this idea that new features can sort of pop up that you didn't intend. And I felt that a lot while working on this book, that there was some sort of like underlying pattern that was finding its way into the writing. So especially toward like the back half of the book, I think it felt like my job was just sort of like trying to connect everything that had emerged and sort of pull it all together. So yeah, I guess that's sort of, it was a long process. Maybe I think it was 3 years totally from the beginning to the end of it. But yeah, it was a fun book to write toward the end. It was difficult, but it was fun.
Thank you for that. I'm curious too about, I know you were a fiction writer. And I hear that in your writing, and I felt that on the page too, even the opening of what you've just read for us. And I lost my place in the book, but something like nobody knew when the robots arrived, or like it feels like such a story or novel opening, and you build such beautiful suspense within each of these sections that I just really admire how you structured each piece to feel like its own story with its own payoff and its own tensions and major dramatic questions. And I'm curious, like, how you think of these individual essays in terms of like that narrative lens or scope, perhaps as a fiction writer, or perhaps there's other media that really influence the way you shape things.
Yeah, I think really I got an MFA in fiction, and I wrote fiction maybe for like the first, I don't know, 10 years that I was writing before I started doing nonfiction. So that's very much like in my DNA as a writer. And I think that there's a lot that that nonfiction writers can learn from studying fiction, and particularly the way you mentioned, like plot and how to sustain narrative suspense. I think probably what's a little bit different, or something that I noticed, I guess, when I switched to essays, is that you have a lot of freedom, I think, with narrative nonfiction, in terms of like the suspense can be your story. On one hand, it can be something that you're trying to dramatize from your life, and it can work much the way that a short story would, or it can also be a sort of an intellectual tension of like trying to figure out what you think about something, or trying to sort of build this drama of ideas across the work. And I think hopefully there's a little bit of both in this book. I do think that probably the main suspense, or at least I don't know if I'm the one to talk about this, because I guess my experience as the writer was like what kept me going was sort of like trying to figure out what I think about all these things, because definitely did not have my mind made up about any of these questions I was writing about ahead of time. It was really just like this work of curiosity and wanting to know more. And I don't know that I really figured any of it out, but it was satisfying to try to make those connections and those leaps. And so yeah, but I guess the overall, like the balance between the personal and the more research sections, that was something that also had to sort of be worked out over many drafts. I think the very first version I did had hardly any of my story in it. And I think that was just a product of being really overwhelmed by the research and wanting to connect all of this stuff. And I would appear here and there as like an eye, but it wasn't really about my story. And then I think that once I started putting more of my experience into the book, it kind of started to come together a little bit more. I felt like that was sort of a connecting thread, or at least that the connections maybe became more convincing to me because they were rooted in my experience. So that's really related to what was going to be my next question about that choice of the eye and how you conceived that eye and point of view, or like literal body moving us through this text and some of these images. And like this could so easily be a different book without that perspective. But I felt so grounded in those experiences the whole way through, and especially
just feeling so like tethered to the narrative view. I don't want to say you, but the narrator of this book, and even through that ending and that like close conversation with the AI bot, and the narrator, it's like always kind of pulling in this intimacy. And I was just thinking about that choice to use the I, and also reckoning with the way people talk about narratives that use the I in terms of nonfiction, how essayists and memoirists and journalists, like people make these distinctions that one could perhaps be more interested in ego, or one is more intellectual, and how, I don't know, I guess I'm wondering if you thought about that as you brought in the self to the narrative. It's something I think about a lot as a memoirist, of like, will this be taken seriously? And how do I show that, it's about experience and memory and all of these other themes that have nothing to do with me. It's just through the lens of me. And it is this narrative me, not me on the page, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. I'm relieved to hear you say that you think about those things and worry about them too, because it can get really, I think there's so much noise in the culture and so much like sort of criticism around personal writing. And there's just a lot of baggage that comes with it, from, on one hand, the idea that it's not as serious as, journalism or criticism. And then I think probably the more common complaint, which is that it's just navel gazing or it's self-indulgent. And obviously I go back and forth between thinking, oh, maybe I have this very like exhibitionist streak, as probably all writers do in some sense, where I like am really interested in my experience. But I think more often I think about it how you were saying that you're interested in these themes, and there's this impulse to use the self as a lens, or to use the self as sort of an entryway into those ideas and those larger themes. And I don't know, I guess I teach also creative nonfiction, and my students express this fear a lot too, like, oh, why am I writing so much about myself? Everyone's going to be bored who wants to hear about my life. And I think like the best cure for that, for me, because I have those voices in my head too, is just to think about all the writers that I love who are first person writers and how much they've affected me. And like, I think just being able to create that sense of intimacy on the page as a reader is something that I really value. And just being able to like live in somebody else's mind. There's like not a lot of other mediums where you can do that. In television or in film, you don't have that sort of sensation of being inside somebody's head. So I do. There was a point, I think like midway through this book, where I realized that question, which was like a craft and aesthetic question, was really bound up with some of the larger ideas I was writing about, which is like, what does it mean to be an I? Is there a self? Is there like, do we have an interior life, or is it just an illusion? And I hadn't really thought about, I always thought, oh, I'm interested in those questions is because of my religious background, and because, I had this deconversion experience where all of that changed. But then I hadn't really thought about how being a writer plays into that too, which I think those questions really arise for anybody who writes especially in the first person. It's like, what is, on one hand, you're aware, I think, that the I is a construction, because you are sort of building this alternate self on the page that is sort of you but not totally you. I think there's like that tension. But on the other hand, you have this experience of like, well, I have all these ideas in my head that feel very like sometimes illusory, or like they're not totally real. But then when you put them on the page, this is like proof, this is like proof of consciousness on the page. So where did these ideas come from, if not from my mind? So yeah, again, that's like one of those problems that I don't know that it became clearer during the writing process, but maybe if anything, I think the questions or the tension became clearer. I was able to articulate sort of what was interesting about it to me.
Thanks for that, Megan. I'm looking at A quote I pulled from you that says, "I teach writing and I often tell my students that craft problems are often content problems in disguise. They tend to enact the very tensions that you're writing about or refusing to write about and can clue you into the story's larger themes." That's what happened with this book. Can you say a little bit more about that, of cue you into the tensions you're writing about or refusing to write about, especially?
Yeah. I hope that that's true. I've been saying that to my students for a while. I noticed, I mean, I don't know that it's always true, but I have noticed in my own work that a lot of times something seems like it's a craft problem. Like, why can't I get this section to work? Why, why does this, why it, a lot of it is sort of this comes under the disguise of like structure questions. Like, why is this not coming together? And it seems like it's a failure of like my ability to do these basic craft techniques. But I think a lot of times it's because there's, something I'm failing to address on the page, something, a lot of times it's sort of this feeling like I don't have a right to tell this story, or sort of those voices of like, you're being self-indulgent, or, don't air your dirty laundry, whatever these sort of like voices that we get in childhood, I think. But yeah, with this book, I think that question, it was really bound up with the I. And I think that I had really, the one issue, and this gets sort of into more of like an abstract question that is the sort of lurking in the background of the book, but a lot of it is about this like conflict between the subjective and objective points of view. So this comes up in the problem of with like the problem of consciousness. Like, we know how the brain works, know a lot about it from this third person objective scientific perspective, but science is still not able to explain what our interior first person experience is, or why we have it at all. So there's that problem. And then I read a little bit later in the book about how this same problem comes up in quantum physics, where you have this observer effect, where actually observing the world on the quantum level changes the bizarre. Nobody really understands why that is. But I think that I hadn't really seen the connection between those two things, or seen how that was a theme in sort of the ideas I was exploring, until I started thinking about the use of the I in this idea, which is like in the book itself, I'm pushing a lot between first person and sort of a more objective first person point of view. And so, I think that moment, and I think it comes like midway through the book, where I started talking more deliberately and explicitly about the I, that sort of, it's like snapped all of these sort of underlying things into place, and I was able to see them more clearly. So it's really cool when that happens. It doesn't always happen. But.
Sorry to interrupt, but Megan, I think we're having some audio interruption. I don't know if it's maybe from your headphones.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah.
Should I try and plug in my headphones? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much for letting me know.
Of course. It was just started happening very recently. So that's why I'm jumping in.
Okay.
But I disappear again to return you to your conversation.
Okay.
Thank you, John. I wasn't sure if it was me. Thank you so much. Let's see. I'm curious about, in terms of my own personal writing and memoir, I'm not really introducing these big themes and concepts and philosophies and ideas the way that your work does. Talking about these concepts of like humankind and nature and the universe. And I was thinking about, and I always encourage students to separate the writing itself from, the public perception or public dialogue, or what it means to actually share the work in the world. And with my book, I feel like even though people think of memoir itself as something so vulnerable, there's nothing people can really like argue with me about besides I remember that differently, which I address like in the author's note right at the beginning, and it kind of ends there. But I was wondering, in terms of your work and your ideas, proposing all of these different ideologies and philosophies. Like, how much do you expect that dialogue to happen once it's actually in the world for people to say, I know that you're proposing this idea, but I think this instead? And how much does that maybe help or generate the work? How much do you have boundaries around like having those conversations with people as you're proposing all of these ideas? Like, what does it look like to you once you actually share the work in the world, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I do think, I mean, I think about that a lot when I'm writing it. And I think that it's like one of the most nerve-wracking, but also probably a generating anxiety while I'm writing it, is that I'm always sort of imagining these voices of critics in my head, or, how could somebody disagree with this? Or is this, you know, a lot of I mean, and I'm not, like, a lot of the fields I'm writing about, I'm just a writer coming to this as a layperson. So a lot of it is like, am I actually getting this right? Am I saying something controversial that's not like well understood within this field, or am I getting something wrong? And yeah, so I think I very much anticipated having those conversations. I haven't had anybody really disagree yet in terms of like reviews, or I think it's still early. People are probably still reading the book at this point, so maybe it'll come up. I got a Amazon review that said I was like trying to prove how smart I was, and that it was a boring book. But that's about it in terms of like challenging the ideas. But yeah, I think that I guess the other question that's sort of interesting to me that is maybe related to that is like the in terms of like using the I and incorporating my personal story. I have like mixed feelings about that too, because on one hand, I love that I have a lot of flexibility in doing this form, where like if I'm starting to say something that is like maybe too objective, or I'm making too strong of an argument or something, I'm always able to pull back and just go to the I instead and say, well, this is my experience, this is how I feel about it. And it's really great. It's great to have that flexibility, but then I also wonder if I use it as sort of like an easy out or something, because nobody, like you said, like people can't really criticize your experience except to say if it didn't happen or whatever. But yeah, it's an interesting form. I love watching essayists do that, whether it's, with like, people who are making an argument through their experience, or just writing about their life. I think that it's really exhilarating for me to watch the way that people use the I on the page, and sort of these little sly rhetorical moves. You're trying to do a lot of things at once. You're trying to establish your authority on the page. You're trying to, get sympathy in a way, or be sympathetic, I guess, toward the reader, but without maybe seeming like it explicitly. So yeah, it's something that I enjoy as a reader as well.
Thanks, Megan. I'm seeing a reminder from John in the chat box to submit your questions using the Q&A. So for everyone, the Q&A box is at the bottom of the window, and we're going to open that up soon. So if you have any burning questions, please do drop those. I have another pull quote from you that I found so beautiful. Nobody consciously decided that the metaphor would become literal. It just happened little by little. It's not unlike how certain passages in religious texts that were once understood metaphorically are taken literally by later generations. As a writer, I'm both fascinated and unnerved by those moments where language seems to slip out of my control. Every writer has experienced this at some point. You call upon an image that turns out later on to be the perfect metaphor for the point you're making, or you realize you've written something much smarter than what you set out to argue. It recalls the old post-structuralist point that we don't speak language, it speaks us. Language, like all technologies, is constantly at risk of escaping our control. I thought that was so beautiful and so true. I've certainly experienced that feeling before. And I was wondering if you could share with us in what ways this book showed you something you didn't know when you began writing it or piecing it together, and maybe other ways it may have felt as that it had escaped your control, in your words. on both a micro and macro level. Maybe it's in the sentences, or maybe it's like the conception of the ideas.
Yeah, what a great question. I think in that quote, I was talking, I guess the starting point for it was, I talk a lot about metaphor in the book, and I talk about technological metaphors, particularly this idea that the brain is a computer. So this has been sort of like a really central metaphor to both AI and cognitive science. And we use it all the time just in everyday speech when we say, oh, I have to like process this information, or I have to like retrieve a memory. We're sort of calling on this digital vocabulary. And when I'm talking about sort of the history of this metaphor in the book, I talk about how it started off like very clearly as a metaphor. When people said that machines were learning or that they were understanding, those terms were put in quotation marks. And now it's sort of become so common that people don't think about it as a metaphor. Like even when I say I'm processing new information, I'm not really thinking that I'm using a metaphor. It's just sort of become part of the fabric of everyday speech. And I guess, I mentioned I'm sort of interested in this because of my religious background too, where, I grew up in fundamentalism, and a lot of the things that I was told as a child, like this really happened, like Noah had an ark and he took all of these animals, during the flood. This is like a historical event. I was like kind of shocked after I left the faith to learn, first of all, that those were like myths, but then also that like not even all Christians believe that those were literal events, that these were, there's a way to read those passages metaphorically or as myth. And so I guess something the book showed me about language. I just became very self-conscious about language while I was writing this book, more so than when I've been writing other books. And I think it was because I was writing about metaphor, and I didn't expect it to be at the outset a book about language, but it's hard when you're writing about metaphors in technology and metaphors in religion to not start thinking about the way that you're making connections and leaps between ideas, that's for me, like one of the most really exhilarating parts of the writing process is making those connections. And there is a way when it happens. And, like you said, I think a lot of writers have experienced this, where you feel like you've stumbled on something or uncovered something that you didn't set out to write about. It almost sort of arose on its own. And there's a way in which that's like a really almost mystical experience when you're writing. But then I worry too sometimes about like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that my unconscious is taking over? I think sometimes you feel like, oh, my unconscious is like smarter than I am. Am I losing control? And I guess that's sort of, I don't know, to me, analogous to sort of these conversations about technology. It's like at one point, does something else emerge and we lose control? I think that itself was a question that sort of emerged during the writing process that I hadn't set out to write about. But yeah.
It was particularly moving to read this book as I've just started taking Hawaiian immersion lessons in Olelo Hawaiian. I am Hawaiian, but I'm not fluent by any means. And I'm really learning about the breakdown of language and vowels, and how in the language with its limited alphabet, every syllable and every vowel and every letter carries its own metaphor. And the words themselves are made up of these stacked metaphors that you can then either pull a single metaphor, depending on how it relates to you that day, or think about it as a whole. Again, back to your theme of kind of these moving parts and systems and how they make up like the greater meaning of the word. And so reading your work and thinking through these ideas has been so meaningful and helpful for me as I'm taking on this other study. So thank you for that.
Fascinating. I didn't know that about Hawaiian. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. You mentioned that this book was really fun to write, and it was actually one of my questions. I'm curious, what was the most fun part to write about this book? It's certainly fun to read, but what did you have the most fun doing here?
What did I have the most fun? Yeah, I enjoyed writing about the robot dog, which is like the first part of the first sort of section is about this period where I lived with Sony Aibo robot dog. And it was sort of fun to be able to like interact with something, you know, off the page and then being able to bring it onto the page. I don't do a lot of like journalism or immersive writing of that sort. So, you know, it's a lot of just like me in front of my computer and my mind and books. So it was kind of cool to have this other like object to interact with and to try to incorporate that into the narrative. And I guess sort of similarly, the very last section you mentioned of where I was talking to the chatbot, that was a fun section to write too, just because I was drawing from, I actually like everything that appeared in that section was things that the chatbot actually said to me. Like I took like screenshots and everything of these conversations. And so it was sort of fun to go through and like, you know, choose all of these like most interesting things that she said and incorporate that into the narrative.
I have to say, I downloaded the app and I told her that we were having an event tonight because it felt like a full circle meta like responsibility or something.
Oh, that's nice.
Congratulations. That sounds great. I just had to check it out after reading that.
Yeah. It's a really wild, like, I don't know. I remember, I think like the last time I used a chatbot before this one was maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, and they've made like leaps and bounds since then. They've become much more intuitive since then.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, I think we'll open up the Q&A box now. And again, everyone, please pick up this book if you haven't already. Order it from Literati if you want to buy it for a friend. Everything from robot dogs to the brothers Karamazov. You will learn so much and be so moved.
We do have a question and from Bill, and I will just add that, yes, please do send your questions. Bill writes, "Hi, Megan, I love this book. My question is, at one point in your process, did you feel like the manuscript was ready to submit to your editor? How did you know? And were you right about this timing? Thanks."
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was a good question. I think this is probably common with a lot of writers, where I was given a deadline when I first started working on this book, and then immediately, like, I don't know, like 9 months later or something, realized I needed more time. So the deadline kept getting pushed back, and at one point, my editor said, "Well, why don't you just like try to send me the first half?" And so I had a deadline. I sent him the first half, and we actually got into like a disagreement at that point about the direction of the book, which was really frustrating at the time, because like I had a very sort of clear vision at that point. I felt like the book was starting to come together. But I had a really great editor. He's really sharp and really wise. And after I thought about it for a while, I sort of realized that he was pointing out some things that weren't working about the balance of the book. And so this was like, man, this was after I'd been working on the book for like 2.5 years. I finally did, you know, got to the halfway point and got feedback. And I ended up like writing a whole new outline at that point for the book. And that was really when it snapped into place. And I don't know, something about getting that outside perspective. I think I needed that time beforehand to news that I was interested in. But that, I think, like having somebody read it and seeing how an outside reader was approaching this material, because I was so immersed in it at that point, was really helpful. So I came up with an outline and then sort of like rearranged a lot of what I'd written. And the book after that, I think it was like 7 months after that I finished the final draft. So it was a lot of like, I guess the process of writing was like a lot of like roaming around, feeling my way through the dark, and then getting feedback, and then sort of writing the final version very quickly. Which is not how I've ever worked before with essays. I think this is really unique to the book.
My old friend and colleague Mairead writes, I loved Interior States and can't wait to read the new one. Can you talk a bit about what you're working on now? What's drawing your attention or what you might explore next?
Yeah. I've really enjoyed since I finished this book, and it's the book is just coming out now, but I finished it over a year ago. So I since like within that past year, I've really enjoyed getting back into essays. I wrote a piece for N+1 that's actually coming. Well, it's in this issue, in this month's issue about natural language processing algorithms, which was really fun to write. So that was sort of on the same theme as technology and sort of what I've been writing about. And I have an essay coming out in Harper's later this year. It's about habits and routines, which is sort of a totally different topic to write about. But yeah, so I've been doing a lot of essays. As far as like projects, I really have no idea what I'm going to do after this. I haven't thought about it that much. I am always talking about going back to fiction at some point, so that's possible. I'll think about that. But yeah, right now I'm just enjoying writing essays and reviews.
Whoops, did not unmute myself. A viewer writes, has recent technology like GPT-3 changed your opinion since you've written the book? If so, how?
Yeah. So yeah, the piece I wrote for N+1 was largely about GPT-3, which for people who haven't been following it, it's this very advanced natural language processing algorithm that's only been out for like a year or so, and it can mimic human language in like a really convincing way. So it's a predictive algorithm. So if you type a prompt, like the first couple sentences of a short story, it'll write a short story for you. And it has a plot, it has characters and consistency. It can do poetry, it can do the news, it can do fake news, it can do all sorts of sort of scary stuff. So yeah, it's amazing how quickly that developed too. Like when I first was writing this book, I think in one of the early chapters I was talking about this blogger who sort of like played around with neural nets, and she taught them how to like create recipes and how to write like the first sentence of a novel. And it was like really seemed very like primitive, the sort of things that they would come up with. And it was really cute. Sometimes they would write these really funny short story opening lines like, "This is the story of a man in the morning," or something like that. And so yeah, just the leaps and bounds that these technologies have taken just in the past couple of years is really remarkable. And as a writer, I'm really interested in language processing algorithms, just because there's been a lot of like fear about like, well, are writers going to be obsolete now? Are we just going to read like novels that are produced by machines? So yeah, I guess, has that changed my view of technology? I think that, I don't know that it's really changed my view. I think it maybe just sort of like distills some of the things I was writing about, particularly this question of like what makes us unique as humans, and the fact that it's always changing depending on what technology can do. So, we used to say like, oh, well, reason is what makes us unique because humans have reason and animals don't. This is like sort of these medieval distinctions. And so for a long time, the test of like whether a computer was intelligent was, if it could beat a human at chess, or if it could do, these really advanced computations. And then once it turned out that machines were really good at that, then we started saying, oh no, actually what makes us unique is our emotions and our sensitivities and our creativity. Like creativity has been the main thing. Even in automation debates today, people say, if you want to have a job in the future, work on being more creative, because that's something that machines can't do. But now we have machines like very recently that are, I don't know if you want to call that creativity, but they can mimic the output of what human creativity looks like. So yeah, I think I'm interested in following those conversations and interested in how that will change sort of how we think about ourselves in relation to machines.
I've seen some AI dreaming paintings that are frustratingly cool
They're so cool,
in
aren't
that
they?
regard.
Too.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
unfair that they get to sort of like look like Max Ernst paintings. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's all feels in like music to art, and it is like weird how it is sort of like they create this avant-garde stuff just because the connections they make between things are so like things that sometimes humans wouldn't think about. Yeah.
Right. There's that usually always an uncanny quality to whatever AI is creating. That's right.
There was an essay recently in The Believer. Did you read it, Megan?
I just saw that. Yeah. About it was a woman who was writing about, she was trying to write about her sister's death, right?
And she kept starting the story over and over, and the technology was filling in the essay about her sister's death. And I've never read anything like it, and I just thought it was so and the way that it appears on the screen, if you look up The Believer, everyone, and look up this essay, I think it's called Ghost or Ghosting, and the text kind of types itself out and appears on your screen, and even that element of it just brings it to this very different level, and it's so moving, this correspondence and the disconnect, and also the connection between the writer and the machine. It's wild.
Yeah, I thought that piece was so brilliant. I loved how it was constructed. And like you said, the production was really cool too, how they sort of recreated the effect of the algorithm writing.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. I would like to go another hour and talk more about these things, but I also want to let both of you and our viewers jump into their blessedly long weekends. So Meghan and Tikira, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati this evening. As I mentioned to you before we went live, we desperately hope to have you both in the store for an in-person event in the not too distant future. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next event, and have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Megan. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much, Tikira. Thanks, John. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Thank you both. Take care.